On January 22, 1945, at Hill 170 in Kangar, Burma, Lieutenant Colonel Simon Trevor of the British No. Commando watched the jungle tree line through the early morning mist. Around him, his 24-man unit was positioned on the northern slope, each soldier holding an M1 Garand rifle, a weapon that had accompanied them since their time in North Africa 2 years prior. Most British forces had never seen an American semi-automatic rifle, but Trevor's men were about to find out just how valuable it was. In less than 90 minutes, 300 Japanese soldiers would launch a suicidal assault directly at their position. Trevor had no idea that he and his men would soon face overwhelming odds, 12-1 against them. But what he did know, what every man in his command knew for certain, was that their M1 Garands gave them a critical advantage in firepower, which would make all the difference between survival and annihilation. The sound of a bolt being drawn echoed in the morning stillness, but it wasn't the familiar sound of a British Lee-Enfield rifle. It was different, smoother, faster, deadlier. A skilled rifleman with an M1 Garand could fire 24 aimed rounds per minute. Meanwhile, the British Lee-Enfield, despite being the fastest bolt-action rifle of its kind, could only manage 15 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. The math was clear. One American rifleman with an M1 Garand could match the firepower of 1.6 British riflemen with Lee-Enfields. In other words, 3 British soldiers firing bolt-action rifles at full speed could barely surpass what one American with a Garand could do. This difference in firepower would prove to be one of the most significant tactical advantages of World War II. A difference measured not just in inches or pounds, but in lives saved and battles won. The story of how America came to field the only semi-automatic infantry rifle among the major powers begins not on the battlefield, but in the workshop of a Canadian immigrant who would change warfare forever. John C. Garand was born on January 1, 1888, in Saint-Remy, Quebec, Canada, on a small farm south of Montreal. There was nothing about his early life to suggest he would someday create the weapon that General George Patton would later call the greatest battle implement ever devised. When he was 11, his family moved to rural Connecticut, where his father abandoned farming for work in a textile mill. By the age of 12, Garand was sweeping floors in a mill in Jet City, but his interest lay not in textiles, but in the machinery that powered the mill. During breaks, he studied the mechanical looms, steam engines, and precision gears that turned raw cotton into fabric. By age 18, Garand was working as a machinist, and his natural ability led him to specialize in tool and gauge making, skills that required both mathematical precision and artistic intuition. Garand continued to hone his skills by taking correspondence courses, teaching himself engineering principles most men learned only in universities. In 1916, at age 28, Garand turned his focus to firearms design, submitting plans for a semi-automatic rifle to the U.S. Navy 2 years later. The Navy was impressed and asked him to continue his work at the Bureau of Standards in Washington. After a year and a half, Garand was hired as a design engineer at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, a legendary facility known for producing the Springfield rifles used in World War I. However, Garand was shocked to find that Springfield Armory was outdated. During the Great War, the Armory had produced only 265,000 rifles, far too few for an army that had grown from 200,000 to 4 million soldiers. Another 47,000 rifles came from Rock Island Arsenal. The shortage led to the U.S. Army arming hundreds of thousands of soldiers with British Enfield rifles, produced by Remington and Winchester under license. Garand recognized that future wars would be won by the nation that could arm its soldiers the quickest with the most effective weapons. He envisioned a rifle that would fire automatically each time the trigger was pulled, eliminating the need to manually cycle the bolt between shots. This would increase the rate of fire by 3 times compared to bolt-action rifles, allowing soldiers to maintain their position and sight picture between shots. This, Garand realized, would shift the balance of firepower decisively in favor of the attacker. However, Garand's path to success was not easy. His early designs, which used primer actuation to cycle the action, proved unreliable. He then switched to gas operation using propellant gases from fired cartridges to power the mechanism. In 1929, his design passed the Army's acceptance trials. Just as victory seemed certain, politics intervened. General Douglas MacArthur, then Army Chief of Staff, insisted the rifle use the existing 30's OS6 Springfield cartridge instead of the newer .276 Peterson round Garand had designed it for. MacArthur's reasoning was economic. There were millions of rounds of .30-06 ammunition already in storage. Starting over with a new caliber would cost millions and delay the rifle's deployment. Garand went back to the drawing board and redesigned the rifle to accommodate the heavier .30-06 cartridge, a process that took 3 years. Finally, on August 3, 1933, his redesigned rifle was officially designated the U.S. Rifle Caliber .30 M1. It was officially adopted by the Army on January 9, 1936. The first production M1 Garand was successfully proofed and fired for accuracy on July 21, 1937. Production began that September, but at first, only 10 rifles were made per day. By January 1940, Springfield Armory was producing 100 rifles a day. But that still wasn't enough as the world edged closer to war. In September 1939, just after Germany invaded Poland, Winchester received a contract to manufacture M1 Garands. Winchester engineers were initially skeptical, believing the rifle was too complex and too costly to produce. Tensions between Winchester and Springfield Armory flared, with each side accusing the other of incompetence. Despite these challenges, production ramped up rapidly as the war progressed. By December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, American factories were producing M1 Garands at unprecedented rates. By January 1942, Springfield was manufacturing 113 rifles per day, and by January 1944, production had peaked, with 122,000 rifles built in a single month, 3936 per day, or 164 rifles per hour. Winchester produced an additional 513,000 rifles between December 1940 and June 1945. By the end of the war in August 1945, over 4 million M1 Garands had been built. The United States was the only major power to field a semi-automatic rifle as standard infantry equipment. The British, Germans, Soviets, Japanese, and Italians all relied on bolt-action rifles. This disparity had profound tactical implications. A rifleman with a bolt-action rifle had to perform multiple manual steps between each shot: lift the bolt, eject the spent case, chamber a new round, and lower the bolt into position. This cycle took 4 to 6 seconds under normal conditions, longer under combat stress. By contrast, the M1 Garand fired automatically after every trigger pull, with the gas-operated mechanism cycling the action. The shooter never had to move his hands or lose his aim. An M1 Garand could fire 8 aimed shots in 20 seconds, while a Lee-Enfield required 48 to 50 seconds for the same number. The firepower advantage was undeniable, and it became one of the most significant factors in the outcome of World War II. A single soldier with an M1 Garand could deliver far more firepower than several soldiers with bolt-action rifles, and it became a defining element in the Allied victory. By the end of the war, the M1 Garand had reshaped infantry tactics forever, a testament to the vision of a Canadian immigrant who had set out to change the way wars were fought. On January 22, 1945, at Hill 170 in Kangar, Burma, Lieutenant Colonel Simon Trevor of the British No.1 Commando stood in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the jungle's tree line. Around him, 24 men waited in forward positions on the northern slope. Every soldier in his unit carried an M1 Garand rifle, a semi-automatic weapon they had brought with them from North Africa 2 years earlier. Most British forces had never seen such an American rifle, but Trevor's men were about to discover its worth. In less than 90 minutes, 300 Japanese soldiers would launch a suicidal assault directly at Trevor's position. They would face overwhelming odds, more than 12 to 1. But Trevor knew one thing with certainty. Their M1 Garands would give them an advantage in firepower that could make all the difference between survival and annihilation. The metallic click of a bolt being drawn back echoed through the early morning mist, but it wasn't the familiar sound of the British Lee-Enfield rifle. It was smoother, faster, and deadlier. An M1 Garand in the hands of a trained rifleman could deliver 24 aimed shots per minute, far outpacing the British Lee-Enfield, which could fire only 15 rounds in the same amount of time under optimal conditions. A single American rifleman with a Garand could match the firepower of 1.6 British riflemen armed with Lee-Enfields. In simple terms, 3 British soldiers firing bolt-action rifles at maximum speed could barely surpass what 1 American rifleman with a Garand could deliver. This disparity in firepower would prove to be one of the most significant tactical advantages of World War II, a difference measured not just in numbers, but in lives saved and battles won. The story of how the United States fielded the only semi-automatic infantry rifle among the major powers begins in a Canadian immigrant's workshop. John C. Garand, a name that would change the course of warfare. Born on January 1, 1888, in Saint-Remy, Quebec, Garand's early life didn't hint at his future success. At age 11, his family moved to rural Connecticut, where his father switched careers from farming to mill work. By age 12, Garand was sweeping floors at a mill in Jet City. Yet his fascination with the machinery that powered the mill became his calling. He studied the looms, engines, and gears that turned raw cotton into fabric. By age 18, Garand was a machinist, excelling in tool and gauge making, skills that combined mathematical precision with creative intuition. Garand's ambition led him to night classes, where he self-taught engineering principles. By 1916, at 28 years old, he began working on firearms design, submitting plans for a semi-automatic rifle to the U.S. Navy. His work impressed the Navy, and they asked him to continue his research at the Bureau of Standards in Washington, D.C. After a year and a half, Garand took a position as a design engineer at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. Upon arrival, Garand found Springfield Armory, famous for producing Springfield rifles used in World War I, was severely outdated. During the Great War, the Armory had produced just two 65,000 rifles, far fewer than needed to arm an army that had grown from 200,000 soldiers to 4 million. To fill the gap, Army relied on British Enfield rifles manufactured under license. Garand saw the coming war and recognized the need for faster, more effective weapons. The rifle he envisioned would fire automatically each time the trigger was pulled, eliminating the need to manually cycle the bolt. This would triple the rate of fire compared to bolt-action designs, allowing soldiers to maintain their aim between shots. Garand's journey to success was full of setbacks. His early designs, which used primer actuation to cycle the action, proved unreliable. He switched to a gas-operated system, using propellant gases from the fired cartridge to power the rifle's mechanism. In 1929, Garand's design won Army acceptance trials, but politics soon intervened. General Douglas MacArthur insisted that the new rifle use the existing 30-06 Springfield cartridge instead of the .276 Peterson round Garand had designed it for. MacArthur's reasoning was purely economic. There were millions of rounds of 30-06 already in stock. Switching calibers would incur unnecessary costs and delays. Garand redesigned his rifle to accommodate the 30-06 cartridge. The process took 3 years. Finally, on August 3, 1933, the rifle was officially designated as the U.S. rifle caliber, 30 M1. It was adopted by the Army on January 9, 1936. The first production M1 Garand was proof-fired in accuracy, tested on July 21, 1937. However, production began slowly, with only 10 rifles per day. By January 1940, Springfield Armory was producing 100 per day, but that was still insufficient as war clouds gathered over Europe. In September 1939, following Germany's invasion of Poland, Winchester received a contract to manufacture M1 Garands. Winchester engineers were skeptical, thinking the rifle was too complex and expensive to mass produce. Relations between Winchester and Springfield Armory were strained, but despite these challenges, production ramped up. By December 7, 1941, the U.S. was fully engaged in the war, and American factories began to produce M1 Garands at an unprecedented rate. By January 1942, Springfield armored 113 rifles per day. By January 1944, production had reached a peak of 122,000 rifles per month, 3,936 per day or 164 rifles per hour. Winchester produced another 513,000 rifles between December 1940 and June 1945. By the end of the war, over 4 million M1 Garands had been manufactured, making the United States the only major power to field a semi-automatic infantry rifle as standard equipment. While the British, Germans, Soviets, Japanese, and Italians all relied on bolt-action rifles, the M1 Garand changed the tactical landscape of World War II. A rifleman with a bolt-action rifle had to perform multiple manual steps between each shot: pull the bolt back, eject the spent cartridge, chamber a new round, and lock the bolt. This entire cycle took 4 to 6 seconds under normal conditions, longer under stress. In contrast, the M1 Garand was gas-operated and semi-automatic. With every trigger pull, the rifle fired, cycled the action, and chambered the next round. The shooter never had to move their hands or lose their aim. The M1 Garand could fire 8 aimed shots in 20 seconds. while the Lee-Enfield required nearly 50 seconds to achieve the same rate of fire. The tactical advantage of the M1 Garand was dramatic. It allowed American soldiers to sustain fire with greater accuracy, maintain their position, and keep the enemy pinned down longer. This firepower disparity proved to be one of the key advantages that helped the Allies win World War II. By the war's end in August 1945, the M1 Garand had firmly established its place in history, not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of innovation, efficiency, and the impact of one immigrant's vision. Garand's rifle had reshaped infantry tactics, ensuring that the United States had the edge in firepower when it mattered most. On January 26, 1945, British commandos had spent weeks fighting in the Arakan Peninsula, executing amphibious assaults to cut off Japanese escape routes. They had taken Hill 170 near Kangar, a crucial position overlooking the main road to Rangoon. Holding this hill was vital. If it fell, British forces on the peninsula would be in grave danger. The Japanese 54th Division understood the importance of this and launched a major counterattack in the early hours of January 31st. Artillery and machine gun fire pounded the northern end of Hill 170, where Lieutenant George Nolan's No. 4 Troop held the line. At 07:30, Japanese infantry began their assault in platoon-sized waves, throwing grenades and charging with fixed bayonets. Nolan's platoon, numbering only 24 men, faced approximately 300 attackers. The odds were terrifying, but the soldiers had one advantage: every man in the unit carried an M1 Garand. The difference was immediately noticeable. The Japanese, armed with bolt-action Type 99 rifles, could not match the rapid, continuous fire from the British semi-automatic rifles. The M1 Garands allowed the British soldiers to keep firing without the pauses required to cycle a bolt-action rifle, cutting down the attackers before they could close in for hand-to-hand combat. Lieutenant Colonel Trevor, who commanded No. 1 Commando, later wrote in his memoirs that the combination of Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and Bren light machine guns gave the British a clear firepower advantage over the Japanese forces. The Garands were particularly valuable because they provided automatic-like firepower without the high ammunition consumption of true machine guns. The battle raged for 12 hours, with wave after wave of Japanese soldiers crashing against the British positions. Lieutenant Nolan moved constantly among his men, distributing ammunition, manning machine guns when crew members fell, and firing his own Garand until he was killed in action. His leadership, combined with the superior firepower of his platoon, held the position against impossible odds. When the attacks finally ceased that evening, over 450 Japanese bodies lay scattered across the hillside. British casualties were severe but manageable. No. 4 Troop had held the line. The firepower advantage had been decisive. For his actions, Lieutenant Nolan was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross. The defense of Hill 170 became a legendary example of how superior weapon technology could overcome numerical disadvantage. It demonstrated on a small scale what American forces experienced across all theaters. The M1 Garand gave infantry units a crucial tactical advantage. They could win firefights through superior volume of fire, disrupt enemy attacks before they gained momentum, and hold defensive positions against larger forces. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army in Europe during 1944-45, praised the Garand in a letter to the Ordnance Department on January 26, 1945. Patton, known for his criticism and rarely offering praise, called the M1 the greatest battle implement ever devised. Patton understood the tactical advantage the Garand provided. His infantry could reliably win firefights, and when the Germans counterattacked, American defensive fire would tear through them. The semi-automatic rifle transformed American infantry from merely adequate to genuinely superior. The M1 Garand's production was equally impressive. Between 1937 and 1945, Springfield Armory manufactured 3 5.26-902 rifles, with Winchester adding 5 and 13.880. By the end of the war, more than 4 million Garands had been produced. Factories operated around the clock in 3 shifts. By mid-1943, Springfield was producing over 4,000 rifles a day. This was achieved despite wartime shortages of skilled labor, with women and older men stepping in to replace drafted workers. Each rifle had to meet strict quality standards. Barrels were carefully inspected, gas systems tested under pressure, and receivers' stress tested to ensure durability. The supply chain spanned the country, from steel mills in Pennsylvania and Ohio to walnut trees in California and Missouri, to specialized factories in Indiana for springs. This massive industrial effort highlighted America's fundamental strategic advantage. The nation's manufacturing capacity, shielded by two oceans from enemy attacks, allowed it to outproduce its adversaries. While Germany struggled to equip every soldier with adequate weapons, America was able to field the most advanced infantry rifle in the world as standard issue. The cost was significant, $85 per rifle in 1943 about $400 today. However, the total cost of $340 million for 4 million rifles was a small fraction of America's total war expenditure of $300 billion. The combat effectiveness of the Garand justified this cost many times over. After the war, the M1 Garand remained in service for another decade. When North Korea invaded South Korea in June 1950, M1 Garand production resumed at Springfield Armory, with two new contractors, International Harvester and Harrington and Richardson, joining production during the Korean War. From 1952 to 1957, a combined total of 1.4 million M1 Garand rifles were produced. The rifles saw combat in Korea against Chinese and North Korean forces who were armed with Soviet-designed weapons. Chinese soldiers often carried PPS submachine guns, which had high rates of fire at close range. However, the M1 Garand's superior accuracy at medium range and its more powerful cartridge gave American forces a significant advantage. Operations research from the Korean War confirmed that most infantry combat occurred within 300 yards, where the Garand excelled. In 1957, the M14 rifle was adopted as the new standard infantry weapon for the U.S. military. The M14 was essentially an improved version of the Garand, with a select fire feature and a detachable 20-round magazine. Production began in 1959 and the M14 gradually replaced the M1 Garand throughout the early 1960s. By 1965, the M1 Garand was phased out of active service, although it continued to be used in some reserve units. Even after the M14 was replaced by the M16 in the 1960s, Garand's basic design principles endured in American military firearms. The M1 Garand's impact wasn't limited to the United States. Over 30 nations purchased or received American surplus Garands, including South Korea, West Germany, Italy, Japan, Denmark, Greece, Turkey, and Iran. Some countries continued to use the rifle well into the 1980s. The M1 Garand's longevity was a testament to its rugged reliability and effective design. British forces who used the Garand in combat preferred it to the Lee-Enfield, and many commandos who carried American rifles in North Africa and Burma continued to use them long after the war. At reunions, veterans often spoke of how the Garand's firepower saved lives and gave them confidence in combat, something bolt-action rifles couldn't provide. The comparison between the M1 Garand and the Lee-Enfield reveals fundamental differences in military philosophy. The Lee-Enfield was designed to be the best bolt-action rifle, fast, smooth, reliable, and accurate, a pinnacle of 19th-century small arms design. On the other hand, the M1 Garand was created to make the bolt-action rifle obsolete. Instead of perfecting existing technology, John Garand designed something entirely new, embodying 20th-century thinking. His rifle utilized machines to do the work that had previously required human effort and coordination. The semi-automatic operation shifted the burden of cycling the rifle from the soldier to the weapon itself. This difference in philosophy extended beyond small arms to America's entire approach to warfare. European powers emphasized training and tradition, while the U.S. emphasized technology and industrial capacity. While other nations sought to maximize the effectiveness of individual soldiers through superior training, the U.S. aimed to multiply the effectiveness of average soldiers through superior equipment. The M1 Garand exemplified this approach. An adequately trained soldier with a Garand could outshoot an expertly trained soldier with a bolt-action rifle. The semi-automatic action made up for differences in skill. A mediocre rifleman with a Garand was more effective than an excellent rifleman with a Lee-Enfield. This isn't to undermine British marksmanship, which remained excellent throughout the war. But marksmanship alone could not overcome the fundamental advantage of firing 8 rounds without having to manually cycle the action, compared to firing 10 rounds with manual cycling between each shot. The physics and mechanics overwhelmingly favored the semi-automatic design, making skill differences secondary. In a 60-second firefight, 3 British riflemen with Lee Lee-Enfields firing at the maximum sustainable rate of 15 aimed rounds per minute could deliver 45 rounds on target. Meanwhile, one American rifleman with an M1 Garand, firing at 24 rounds per minute, well below the rifle's maximum capacity, would deliver 40 rounds. While 3 bolt-action rifles barely exceeded one semi-automatic rifle, the real advantage lay elsewhere. The 3 British riflemen occupied 3 positions, presenting 3 targets to enemy fire. They required 3 times as much food, water, and ammunition. A single American rifleman could deliver nearly the same firepower while using only 1/3 of the personnel resources. In tactical terms, an American infantry squad of 12 men armed with the 11 Garands and 1 Browning automatic rifle, BR, could deliver more sustained fire than a British section of 10 men, armed with 9 Lee-Enfields and 1 Bren gun. The U.S. squad had 2 additional soldiers, but their firepower advantage far surpassed what the 2 extra riflemen would have provided. This shift in firepower dynamics fundamentally impacted squad tactics. American doctrine emphasized fire and movement, with one group suppressing the enemy while another maneuvered to flank. The Garand made this strategy feasible, as soldiers could maintain continuous fire without frequent reloading pauses. Suppressed enemies couldn't return effective fire, allowing American troops to advance. British tactics, relying on bolt-action rifles, required careful coordination to ensure soldiers didn't reload at the same time, leaving gaps in the fire output. Similarly, German forces using the Karabiner 9AK bolt-action rifle faced similar limitations. The German Wehrmacht's tactics revolved around the use of MG-34 or MG-42 machine guns, with riflemen supporting the machine guns instead of providing primary firepower. While this strategy worked well defensively, it limited offensive flexibility. In contrast, American squads could advance with every rifleman contributing meaningful fire, creating a more dynamic offensive capability. The Soviet Union fielded millions of semi-automatic rifles like the SVT-40 and SKS, but these weapons never matched the reliability and mass production of the M1 Garand. Soviet infantry mixed semi-automatic rifles with Mosin, Nagant bolt-action rifles, lacking the uniformity of American forces. Japan attempted to develop semi-automatic rifles, but their efforts never reached beyond the prototype stage. Japanese industry lacked the precision manufacturing capabilities to produce such complex weapons in large quantities, leaving their soldiers with the bolt-action Arisaka rifles, which held only 5 rounds. The disparity in combat effectiveness was enormous. The M1 Garand's impact extended far beyond World War II into subsequent conflicts and the development of military firearms. Garand's basic operating system, gas-operated, semi-automatic with a rotating bolt, became the foundation for military rifles worldwide. The Soviet AK-47, the American M16, the British Sa-80, and countless other designs are built on Garand's system. Modern military rifles, while capable of fully automatic fire, primarily use semi-automatic mode for accuracy in combat. The fundamental principle of allowing the rifle's mechanism to cycle automatically between shots, rather than requiring manual operation, traces directly back to Garand's work in the 1920s and 1930s. He revolutionized infantry combat more than any other firearms designer of the 20th century. John Garand himself never profited from his invention. He was a civil servant earning $3,500 annually when he designed the rifle and chose not to patent it separately, allowing the government to own the design. After World War II, Congress debated granting him a 100,000 reward for his contributions, but the rifle's lasting legacy in military history was reward enough. The legislation to reward John Garand failed. Although he received various medals and honors, he was never compensated financially in proportion to his contribution. He retired from Springfield Armory in 1953 at the age of 65, after spending 34 years refining and perfecting his rifle. He lived quietly in retirement until his death in 1974 at age 86. By then, over 5 million M1 Garands had been produced. His rifle had served American forces through 3 wars, and his design principles continued to influence military rifles worldwide. The difference in strategic calculations between the U.S. and Britain during World War II becomes clear when considering the decision to retain the Lee-Enfield in British service. In 1940, Britain was facing an immediate existential threat. The possibility of a German invasion was real, and the nation's survival depended on the production of existing, known weapons. Adopting a new rifle would have disrupted production for months, a luxury Britain could not afford. Furthermore, the British Empire had global commitments, with forces stationed across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific. Standardizing on a new rifle would have required replacing weapons across the globe, making logistics a nightmare. Britain's industrial capacity was also limited compared to America's. British factories were vulnerable to German bombing raids, which destroyed factories, killed workers, and disrupted supply chains. Introducing a new, more complex, and expensive rifle would have further strained their manufacturing capabilities. So, Britain continued using the Lee-Enfield, relying on superior training and tactics to make it work. The Mad Minute drill instilled a level of weapon handling skill that partially compensated for the technological disadvantage. In contrast, the United States, protected by vast oceans, was able to operate its factories at full capacity without fear of bombing. The American industrial base could absorb the cost of producing complex weapons like the M1 Garand. The United States could afford to equip every infantryman with a semi-automatic rifle because its manufacturing capabilities were unmatched. This difference in strategic circumstances explains why America was able to field technological advantages in many areas, not just small arms. American forces had more trucks, radios, artillery, and aircraft because American industry could produce these in abundance. The M1 Garand was one example of how industrial capacity directly translated into military effectiveness. The rifle's legacy continues today, with many M1 Garands still in use at shooting ranges and in private collections. Over 80 years after its introduction, the M1 Garand remains a popular choice for civilian shooters because of its accuracy, reliability, and historical significance. John Garand's personal rifle, serial number 1,000,000, was sold for $287,500 in 2018, and a rifle gifted to Senator John F. Kennedy sold for $149,500 in 2015. Original wartime rifles in good condition fetch premium prices, reflecting their lasting importance. The M1 Garand's story ultimately represents the triumph of innovation over tradition. The Lee-Enfield was the pinnacle of bolt-action technology, refined over decades. But perfecting an old design couldn't compete with creating something new. The semi-automatic action wasn't just an incremental improvement, it was fundamentally different. It revolutionized infantry combat. John Garand understood that soldiers needed weapons that worked with them, not weapons that required constant skill to operate effectively. His rifle did the mechanical work of cycling between shots, freeing soldiers to focus on aiming and shooting. This seemingly simple innovation had a profound impact on combat effectiveness. The comparison between the M1 Garand and the Lee-Enfield highlights the core differences in military philosophy. 3 British soldiers with Lee-Enfields, firing at their highest trained rate of 15 aimed rounds per minute, could deliver 45 rounds per minute combined. In contrast, 1 American rifleman with an M1 Garand, firing 24 aimed rounds per minute, a conservative estimate, would deliver 24 rounds. However, the American soldier would maintain his position, never interrupting his aim, and wouldn't need time to manually cycle the bolt between shots. This made his fire more consistent, more accurate, and more sustainable. In practical terms, 1 American rifleman with a Garand could functionally match 2 soldiers with Lee-Enfields. The Garand's superior firepower didn't just come from rate of fire. It was the consistency and efficiency of the weapon that gave American infantry a clear advantage. American infantry squads, typically armed with the 11 Garands and a Browning automatic rifle bar, could deliver more sustained rifle fire than a British section with 9 Lee-Enfields and a Bren gun. The U.S. squad, while having 2 extra soldiers, could suppress enemies more effectively with their firepower advantage. This shift in firepower had a profound impact on tactics. American doctrine emphasized fire and movement, where one element of soldiers would suppress the enemy, while another flanked their position. The Garand allowed soldiers to maintain continuous fire, without frequent reloading pauses. The suppressed enemy couldn't return effective fire, allowing American soldiers to maneuver. British tactics, with bolt-action rifles, required more careful coordination. Soldiers had to stagger their reloading to ensure someone was always ready to fire, which created gaps in fire output. Other armies, like the Germans, also faced limitations with their bolt-action rifles, the Karabiner 98K. The German military relied on machine guns like the MG-34 and MG-42 for primary firepower, with riflemen supporting them. While this worked defensively, it limited offensive flexibility. In contrast, American squads could advance with every rifleman contributing meaningful fire, enhancing offensive capability. The Soviet Union fielded semi-automatic rifles, such as the SVT-40 and SKS, but these weapons never achieved the reliability and production volume of the M1 Garand. Soviet infantry mixed semi-automatic rifles with Mosin, Nagant bolt actions, and the Red Army never achieved the equipment uniformity seen in American forces. Japan, despite attempts to develop a semi-automatic rifle, never succeeded in mass production, leaving their soldiers with the bolt-action Arisaka rifle, which held only 5 rounds. The M1 Garand's legacy extends far beyond World War II. It set the standard for military rifles worldwide. The operating system Garand perfected, the gas-operated, semi-automatic action with a rotating bolt, became the foundation for rifles like the Soviet AK-47, the American M16, and the British Say-80. Modern military rifles, while capable of fully automatic fire, still primarily use semi-automatic mode for accuracy, a principle directly traced to Garand's design. Garand revolutionized infantry combat more than any other firearms designer in the 20th century. Despite not profiting from his invention, Garand's rifle left an indelible mark on military history. He chose not to patent the M1, allowing the U.S. government to own the design. Congress debated giving him a $100,000 reward after World War II, but the lasting recognition of his work was the true reward. The M1 Garand's development and success exemplify America's approach to warfare, leveraging technology, industrial capacity, and innovation to multiply the effectiveness of its soldiers. It was not just a weapon, it was a game changer, and its impact on military tactics and design is still felt today. The Garand's influence and legacy endure, proving that sometimes innovation trumps tradition.